Good evening. I'm Jerry Herbert, and as chair of a very dedicated Village Library Committee who welcomes everybody to the library and supports local authors, it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the launch of Charles Giuliani and Pippi Giuliani's book, Annisquam, Pip and Me Coming of Age, which you may purchase, by the way, in the back. Charles will speak about his family and the cultural background of Cape Ann, followed by Pippi, who will share her thoughts about summers in Annisquam as a young girl. What follows them is up to all of you, and it is what is especially meaningful to Charles and Pippi. They invite you to share your recollections of Annisquam, whether it be growing up here or vignettes from a more recent time. Their talks will present a wide scope, I think, for our own reflections. So that's the outline of the evening. Now to the substance. Charles throws a great party, is an artist, writer, art historian, and critic, and a lover of good times. As an arts journalist, he has held staff positions with Boston After Dark, Phoenix, Boston Herald Traveler, Art New England, and Art News. This is his 8th book since 2014, and it was supported by Gloucester Writers Center and Manship Artist Residency. Pippi, a beautiful spirit, graduated from the University of Wisconsin and Lesley University with advanced degrees in education. Returning from traveling in Asia, where she lived and studied in a Buddhist monastery, she worked for the Department of Mental Health in Winthrop. For 36 years, Pippi has worked with middle school children with special needs.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming tonight. We are, of course, overwhelmed by this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, quite literally. Coming up here to this space was, kind of hit me in the face because it's where I remember sweating out summer nights through a variety of shows, and including one in which my niece, Sarah, was a tree. She was a very good tree. And later she played oboe in Oklahoma. And so this was, a great place. And, it's been so beautifully renovated. If you look at it, it's just a fabulous space. So I'm glad that they moved us up from the library to here where we can spread out and be more comfortable. And also, just coming in here and looking at the paintings on the wall is a vivid reminder of what this book, a lot of this book is really all about, which is the cultural history of Cape Ann. And I remember Margaret Fitzhugh Brown from our youth in the 1950s and her studio down in Gloucester Cove. And I remember at the time being annoyed that she was the first person to block parking in front of her house, which now seems to be ubiquitous. One of the things about then and now and coming back to Gloucester is that driving to Gloucester yesterday, just for fun, just to see what was going on in town, it's virtually impossible to find a parking space. So, things have really changed. And also, it doesn't smell as fishy as it used to. And it didn't seem that there were that many gulls still squawking, So, I kind of grew up in Annisquam, and we would take the bus in front of the village hall to go downtown to go to the movies. And there were 2 movies in downtown Gloucester, The North Shore, which was kind of okay, and the strand where your feet stuck to the floor from the gum, where I vividly remember seeing House of Wax in 3D with, what was it, Vincent Price? That was kind of fun, and other movie. I think I saw Seven Brides and Seven Brothers at the North Shore Music Theater, no, North Shore Cinema, all of which is now gone. If you want to go to the movies, I guess you have to go out by the causeway, which we may do, because there are some interesting films right now. But it's kind of overwhelming to see you all. I should give you a kind of capsule overview. When we were here last November at the invitation of Manship Artist Residencies, and Rebecca Reynolds is here tonight, who runs that program. She kind of kept asking me, you know, you're writing a book, what's it about? You know, and I kind of gave her vague answers because, you know, I had an idea in my mind, but it was far from, you know, gelled into a final product. And so, fortunately, we were persuasive enough to have that wonderful opportunity. During which time, my primary focus was learning about the cultural and visual art history of Cape Ann, about which, extraordinarily, since I'm now an artist, critic, and art historian, I knew virtually nothing. All I knew about art on Cape Ann was kind of vaguely Fitzhugh Lane, now Fitzhenry Lane. I vaguely knew of him. And then in graduate school, when I studied art history, I was doing a thesis on Provincetown, which seemed where the real stuff was. So, and then, you know, when we started this research, Susan Aroney who's here tonight, was enormously helpful. She had done while she was employed by the Cape Ann Museum, she did an incredible history of the artists of Cape Ann. And she was very generous in allowing me access to that manuscript, which you will find in the book has been quoted quite generously. So she kind of created the template of where to start the research. Rebecca is an authority on American sculpture, and she was very helpful sketching for me the sculptures of essentially Lanesville and Annisquam. Like I didn't even know, I knew there was Joni on the Pony, but I had no idea who did it, you know. And, you know, to my chagrin, I'm really embarrassing myself to say these things, but I learned that it was Anna Hyatt Huntington, who, interestingly enough, had a studio right on the other side of, if you go over the causeway out of Annisquam, the bridge where you can see into the cove, apparently her studio, and Rebecca can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure she will, her studio was immediately to the right, and I think she resided here, but had the studio there. And it's there that she made the model for the Joan of Arc statue that was actually built out, fabricated, and cast in Paris, but nobody believed her. You know, it wasn't possible that a woman could make a monumental sculpture of that level and quality. So interesting that she did not win a prize. But of course now, and that was, I think it's also in New York as well as here. And A. Pyatt Andrew is the one that commissioned the sculpture that's here. In the process of this research, I was astonished to find that Annisquam had been a likely artist colony. And amazing people had passed through here, like Maxfield Parrish and his father, who was a distinguished etcher. They came, and A.C. Wyatt, Andrew Wyatt's father, spent the summer here. You know, who else was here? Winslow Homer, Um, William Morris Hunt, his brother was Richard Morris Hunt, the architect. William was a painter and was a great friend of the Barbizon artists of France, which is why so many great Barbizon paintings are in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And he had a colony of artists in the summer in Magnolia. And then he died tragically. He died quite young, but his chief assistant took her students here to Annisquam, where apparently they painted apple blossoms. Apparently. What a rousing subject. How incredible. We're staying at the Bryn Mawr right now, although we're supposed to keep that a secret. Alice is kind of upset that there are a couple of images of the Bryn Mawr in the book. She's like, oh my God, now they'll all be flooding in. I said, don't worry, this is not going to be a bestseller. Some people will know this. But if you know Alice, she's a wonderful hostess, and every morning around coffee you get bits and pieces of conversations and chatter. And somebody was asking her about the history of the Bryn Mawr, and she said something I didn't know, that apparently the Bryn Mawr was one of 3 inns. There were 2 kind of on the hill above. One apparently burned down, and another was leveled. So if you look in the book, you'll see that there's a wonderful photograph of this shack along the water that was called the Dewdrop Inn. And so it's hard to believe that Annisquam was affordable, and that, the Annisquam that we knew when our family moved here in 1949 and built a house in Norwood Heights. And, Annisquam today is certainly not affordable. And so it's kind of become a cul-de-sac time capsule in a way. So the book that we collaborated on is kind of a snapshot of a time. When we were here in the 1950s, growing up, trying to make our way in a community that wasn't responsive to last names that ended in vowels. So we had different responses to that. I became the kind of bad boy rebel, kind of, and kind of leader of the pack of the outsider gang. And it's interesting. There would be big parties that, I'd walk down the beach and I'd hear the music coming from the porch of one of the houses, and I wasn't invited. And I'd feel sad, like that I was clearly not accepted. So the following week, I throw a bigger party. Some of them were so famous that, my sailor friends from Marblehead came, and from Boston and all around, and there were cars all up in Norwood Heights, and around midnight, the police would start calling, and I was kind of in the bag, and I would say, yo, so I'll throw them all out. And then my parents were doctors, and they came to Annisquam on the weekends, and my mother would go down to Lighthouse Beach with her friends, and they would say, Joe, do you know what Charles did this time? And so my mother would call me in, and I'd get grounded, like the big threat was you can't go to Marblehead Raceway, And here's the list of chores you have to do. You have to cut the lawn, you have to trim the bushes, you have to be a good boy, you da-da-da-da-da-da. So that's how it kept me in mind. And Pip had entirely different responses, and she'll talk to you about that. I just want to say one word before I pass it on to Pip, that this has been an extraordinary experience for me and for Pip. In the sense that she'll talk about this, so I don't want to preempt her, but it kind of happened during COVID, when, we were all shut down, wearing masks. You know, I remember Astrid was cleaning the mail every week, you know, wiping down the grocery bags and that kind of thing. And Pip and I were having these long conversations about life and mortality and memory. And she would tell me these fabulous stories. And I said, Pip, please, write it down and send it to me. And she would say, okay. And time would go on, that nudge her again. Come on, Pip, you can do it. And she would finally send it to me, and the next day I'd publish it. And so, she would be shocked by that. Oh my God, you know, I'm in print. But what I discovered, and I hope you will too, is that Pip is a wonderful writer. Very different from me. You know, like I have my own style and technique. I'm, you know, kind of a journalist. I've been writing all my life. And to me, writing is like getting out of bed in the morning or having a cup of coffee. It's just a natural thing. Whereas for Pip, it's been labor coming from inside. And I think that you'll feel that quality in the writing, that it has a kind of depth, sincerity. She chooses her words very carefully. And oftentimes, you know, I've talked with her, you know, she's kind of been willing to out herself in terms of going public with very private, very personal things about her life, including her 3.5 months in a monastery in Thailand, which is an extraordinary part of the book. And we, you know, people, you know, there's a 9-year difference in our age. People often ask, well, how did you get together? When she came back from Thailand, I was by that time the jazz and rock and roll critic for the Daily Boston Herald Traveler. So I had the best job in the world, which was to go out at night, listen to jazz and rock, and come and write it up in the paper. And so a lot of times I would invite Pip to come with me. And so Pip would come to rock concerts and jazz clubs and different things. And so she kind of made the scene, so to speak. And she had a terrible crush on Peter Wolf, who lived in my building in Cambridge, which was a very famous building. It was on University Road across from the post office. It was known as the Murder Building because there were, in fact, 3 famous murders in that building. One was a victim of the Boston Strangler who had signature things that I won't discuss with you that he did to his victims that identified it. And another of the murders was one that was never solved, in which a young lady was murdered and laid out in a ritual manner, surrounded by exotic candles and incense and exotic, you know, materials. She was a graduate student in anthropology who did research in the Amazon. And her professor was often implicated as a person of interest, but the crime was never solved. So it became known as the Murder Building. And for that reason, rent was really cheap. And when Peter Wolf was not on the road, he lived there, as did Magic Dick from the Jay Giles Band, and some other people passed through and so on. I remember Andy Leibovitz, you know, shooting Peter in the alley behind the house. And that's where I gave one of the great famous parties. You said I was a famous party giver. I gave a party for Alice Cooper. And all of Cambridge showed up. It packed into my basement apartment. My apartment was virtually destroyed. And the next day, the DJ from WBCN, Maxanne, came by. She says, "I want to witness the crime." You know, like, so I was just totally in the bag, but I had to go report to work anyway. It didn't matter. But anyway, so Pip and I were out and about, and I was told to keep it brief. You know, like Pip and I were out and about at one of these rock and roll parties, And I said, Pip, this is Peter. Peter, this is Pip. And she, deer in the headlights.
As Charles was describing to you, we had an idea. We had phone conversations. And actually, it began with, Charles, you know, it's about time, I think, would you mind writing my obituary? Because, not that I was getting ready in particular, but he probably knows me more and better than anyone else, and he's a writer, so I figured he'll come up with something. Who knows what? Pip, this is Peter, Peter, this is Pip. Boy, am I glad I dodged that bullet, because a life on the road with a rock star, I don't think so. Oh, well, I would have had fun, but anyway. So, friends and family and community members of Annisquam, this is really overwhelming this evening, your support and your interest, especially where this book was serialized so many times over the course of the last 9 months that you probably all read it already. So that you're still interested in supporting us and being here tonight. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much. I do appreciate it. So I got stories, but I'm not going to tell stories. I'm going to read a couple of little excerpts. It's only going to take about 8 minutes. And then, when I'm done, I want your stories. That's what this evening is all about, and that's kind of what this book is about, to stimulate you all to say something. Your time here in Annisquam, your time growing up, whether you were in Annisquam or you weren't in Annisquam necessarily. We have Steve Harris is doing a beautiful job, as always, filming this, and we'll have it. We'll have this for posterity. So don't be shy. It doesn't have to be, you know, a jewel, but anything. I want you to come up, and I want you to give your name and then your story, please. And by the way, in the meantime, if you're restless, the toilet is back there, the food is here, the drinks are here, so feel free to get up, walk around. Sarah, my daughter, back there is going to be selling books later on, so please, you know, visit her as well. I didn't see you back there, Sarah. You were waving to me, but I didn't know who you were. Oh, yes. It's great to see you. Okay. I promise you, 10 minutes, no more.
You said 8.
I said 8. Thank you, families. Isn't it wonderful to have family? Actually, it is 8 minutes, but I think I'll probably talk in between. So, on page 96, if anyone wants to follow along, making mischief. It was always fun to explore Charles's room. He had tons of books and comics that filled the drawers by his bed. In the top left corner of his bureau drawer was a pack of Cools. He didn't much care about those, but I did, on occasion. There were smokes available all over the house, but mentholated Cools lived up to their name. His drawer had a pleasant scent of pine and spice that enveloped the arrowheads collected from the beach. He perfected the mounting of butterflies and moths, displayed in frames on his wall. I remember feeling ambivalent watching him process the insects, but the results were beautiful. Bows and arrows for archery lined his closet next to his sail bag. Dad had .22 caliber rifles and a shotgun for the backyard target practice. I had a good eye and was a decent shot, channeling my idol Annie Oakley. Those were the days when Annisquam was rustic and no one cared what you did in your own backyard, from burning brush to shooting guns and arrows. The good old days. First camp. At age 6, I was enrolled in a summer program run by the artist Mary Jane Horton who lived with her family in an elaborate Victorian house on Adams Hill Road. Mary Jane was fun, inventive, and kind-hearted. She taught us to swim, build rowboats, pick blueberries, and make afternoon Kool-Aid. The magic of red and orange and purple dissolving in water swims in memory, as does the powder, sweet and sour, when licked raw. Mary Jane loved her Irish setters. The campers made chocolate cake in celebration of the setters' birthdays. Something was amiss, however, as campers were served slices and the dogs got the entire cake. In Mary Jane's world, animals were at the top of the hierarchy. Despite the inequity, the devil's food cake was delicious. Through all these wonderful experiences, Lindsay Krause and I became pals. Lindsay went on to successful career as an actor of stage and screen. When the weather was inclement, Mary Jane would leave us alone to invent characters or play with her mother's costume jewelry. We climbed her tower dressed in vintage outfits with the amazing view as our theater backdrop. One camp outing brought us to downtown Gloucester. On the docks, we came upon a litter of kittens. I wanted one so badly, but Mary Jane said I needed permission. Midweek, I forged a note that was accepted, and the next day the kitty came home with me. By the time Mom and Dad arrived for the weekend, the kitten was already ensconced. Charles named her Vampira, after the television femme fatale, Vampire. It was impossible to think Mary Jane was fooled by this phony note. The only explanation I can come up with was her motivation to give this kitten a chance at life. Years later, I opened a book of poetry to find woodcut illustrations by Mary Jane. She was a gifted free spirit who cried as readily as she laughed, exposing her beautiful set of gleaming white teeth. I note with reverence and appreciation that Mary Jane introduced me to the mysteries of the natural world and to the beauty of art making. One more. Clarky. My pal Clarky Ross was a neighbor. This is called Enter Without Knocking. Autumn came to be the most desirable season when all the summer folk went home. The landscape quieted down and uninterrupted beauty was restored. My neighbor, Clark Ross, only a year younger than I, was my friend in autumn and in early spring. He could talk his way in or out of any situation. Often he would pick Mrs. Vance's flowers, ring her doorbell, and sell them to her. True story. She always obliged, such was his charm. I followed him in and out of the houses, picking up a snack here and there, making brief conversations, and zooming on to the next location. Doors were always open. There was no need to knock. We made the rounds of the Littlefields, the Fosters, the Ives, the Bishops, and the Breeds. Sometimes we played in their houses, probably without their knowledge. The neighborhood was open country without borders, and Clark was the mayor and undeniable town crier. We spent many evenings playing softball in the Rosses' vacant lot. Nate Ross, Clark's father, kept the game competitive, but fun with jokes and antics. He taught me how to hold the bat and swing. His coaching of "don't took the bat" still rings. Finally, a place of belonging. One spring weekend, I wanted to take the lead in our adventures. Behind our house, we had a wonderful outcrop of granite boulders and a small circle of stones that looked like a campfire. Native American themes never seemed to capture Clark's imagination, no matter the evidence of their existence all around us. So on this day, I decided to ignite his imagination by building a fire and creating a story of us as Native people. No sooner had the fire taken hold than I realized we needed water to keep it under control. I left him in charge while I grabbed an empty Babson's milk bottle for water. By the time I returned, the flames were spreading like prairie fire. Clark ran home, and I ran to wake Charles, who instinctively grabbed the blanket from his bed, soaked it in the tub, and ran out to beat the flames. He charged me to call the fire department. The telephone operator connected me to the station, and I blurted out the details as best I could. It seemed like forever before the truck arrived from the Bayview station. We could hear the sirens as they circled around trying to locate the house and closest hydrant. In those days, houses had no numbers, so you had to describe the house's location. Eventually, hoses sputtered with low water pressure just before the flames licked the shingled house next door. Minutes later, the house would have gone up like a tinderbox. Charles found me kneeling in front of the Virgin Mary, praying with everything I could promise. He told me to hide under the bed or I was going to jail. The episode's repercussions were deep and psychological. I owed Charles my life, but he scared me to death with the thought of a prison sentence. The event was a landmark in our friendship. From then on, Clark never again let me guide our adventures. He stuck to playing business office, where he was always in charge, and I took direction. Now it's your turn. So here's the idea. If you are so willing to come and stand here, Steve Harris will get a better view of you than if you just, hunker down in the rows. So we certainly can pass this microphone to you if you're really object to standing up here, but we would love to have you come up. Give us a story. Tell us something. Tell us your name first so we know who you are. And talk, Just talk. Do I have anyone who is game to get this ball rolling?
Right here.
Oh, I see Dave Purse.
Thank you, Charles and Pippi, for putting this together.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for the thoughts. I don't know if anybody's ever objected to my not being able to speak in public, but I certainly will speak in the mic. I grew up here on Pippi's Vintage, and this is a wonderful place to grow up. This was a terrific place to come of age. In fact, I'm still coming of age. I hope to. So one of the little vignettes I wanted to give you took place, at least some of the scene in crime, was actually in this very room. And this was sort of my misspent youth. And I had some adventures as well, not least of which burning down a barn. But anyway, so it turned out I was probably 12 or 13 years of age, and it was in the late 50s, early 60s. And rock and roll was becoming a dance of the times, and a lot of the parents, and mothers particularly, thought it'd be a wonderful thing if some of the children in the village took ballroom dancing. So they decided to get together, and they hired, I believe it was Don Knotts Dancing School, to come here on Thursday nights. Remember, Thursday nights are important. Remember Thursdays. So they would come here, and I think there were about 20 of us. I was a winter child, so I get here all year long. So things did actually happen in this hall in the winter times. There were Halloween parties we had. I believe it was in January and February, in the cold winter months, we had dancing school. And the Knott's dancing company consisted of Don Knott and his wife, and the mother-in-law, who was the henchman. And a Victrola, they came up with their records, and they would teach us dance here in this hall. I said about 20 of us, I think, my cousin Beanie Emmons, and Debbie Russ, and Peggy Heberly, and some Babsons, and some Rosses, various people who come. And you think that maybe dancing could be something that was enjoyable? But ballroom dancing was not. You couldn't talk. The girls had to come in dresses and leather shoes, and they had to sit with their ankles crossed. And the boys had to be in coats and ties and leather shoes. And so it was not particularly enjoyable. So it was interesting because the very first or second night of practice, I realized that I was 12 or 13 and girls were becoming somewhat interesting to me. And so I thought the polite thing to do was, because you had the face-to-face dancing ballroom style, that they had this gum called Dentine gum. It was supposed to freshen the breath. But chewing gum was provoking. Talking, laughing, anything like that was not possible. So I managed to, the first or second night, I had some Dentine gum in my mouth. And the mother-in-law, with her white gloves, came over to me and said, announced in the middle of the hall, "Are you chewing gum?" in a very loud voice. And I looked at her, she had her hand in front of me. And I said, "Yes, I'm sorry." And I thought with her hand in front of me, she wanted me to spit the gum out into a white glove. She was appalled. She was apoplectic. She turned purple. She had a look that was like laser vision. She could burn your eyes out. I worried if she looked at you, she could burn your eyes out. I never looked at her in the face again. So early on, I was not her favorite person. And I've forgotten, but they managed to, the girls sat on one side, the boys sat on the other side, we managed to do some ballroom dancing. But toward the end of the first year of program, several of us thought we would show our appreciation for such a wonderful night. And as long as I've lived, trash day in Annisquam is when? Friday, thank you. Dancing school was Thursday night. Clem Deering lived across Leonard Street, where Brad and Marlene are now. And Clem Deering was grandfather to Kirk and George Williamson. And I did some work for him at the time. It was Clem Deering, electrical contractors. He was a big man. And somebody you listened to, he could shout. So he had, in those days, trash was in big trash barrels, galvanized trash barrels. And trash was not much plastic, glass and cans. And so we went out and decided, they parked their car in front of Clem Deering's house. And where the little arbor way goes down, where the trash barrels were. And it took them about 10, 15 minutes to get their Victrola out, their records, and turn out the lights. So we went out and tied up, we said, "Wow." What's that?
Can we move along?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So we tied the barrel to the back of the car. And they drove out. Clem Deering came out, was horrified, shouted at them, because where they stopped was right at Bridgewater Street. All cans and bottles rolled down the street. Anyway, so thank you. So my dancing career was short-lived.
I'm Elizabeth Warnock, and I have a question for all of you. How many of you have climbed Swan Rock? If you climbed Swan Rock between 1952 and 2016, I might know more about you than you want me to. As I came in today, I reminded Daniel Lyman and Petey Littlefield that I heard at least one conversation that they had sitting on Swan Rock, because my bedroom, for most of my life, was right across from the top of Swan Rock. I heard a lot of stuff. But, as Jock Burnett will attest, I can't say anything because somebody might tell some stories about me too. Because I also spent some time there. But I just want to also say the one thing about the word that came to mind as I sat here and listened to you two talk about Annisquam is freedom. I would get up the first day of summer, no shoes on my feet, my two dogs. I'd wander around Annisquam and collect other dogs on the way. I didn't put shoes on until the day before I went back to school, unless I had to, go somewhere like the shopping mall or something. But within the borders of Annisquam, there were no boundaries. Country without boundaries, as Peggy said. And it was an amazing feeling. I was one of the millions of kids who thought the Annisquam pasture was mine. We all thought that. And I would spend hours hours there with my dogs on the beach and in the pasture and never see another soul. And sometimes forget what time it was and the sun would set. So in that respect, your book brought a lot of that back to life for me. So thank you, and be careful what you say on Annisquam Rock.
I want to thank Pippi and Charles for writing this memoir. Because the stories that Pippi just told brought me back to a time that just doesn't exist now. That Annisquam was such an evocative place that was really informed by areas that we had no idea we owned them. A lot of overgrowth. We could go into the woods. I have many memories of Pippi and I playing with choke cherries, getting them all over our feet, collecting them and doing things with them. Mary Jane's was an extraordinary experience. The dogs eating their birthday cake with the candles. Sometimes sitting at the dining room table with their paws neatly on their plate. But really, what Pippi brought, just now, both of you, were these memories that are so important to write down, that the kind of evocative nature of this place, of the landscape, how it, well, I know that my relationship with Pippi really began to inform who I was as an actor, as someone of the theater. Pippi's quite theatrical. I'm sure we dressed up as all kinds of things, and we lay down and identify the clouds, as characters and animals. These were the things that we were doing in the summer. Just natural things, sweet things. But always, I felt that Pippi was an exotic person. Someone who could come up with some kind of story or identity or something. So I'm thrilled that both of you have written this memoir. I think all of us should do something similar, because the sacredness, the preciousness of these memories is just so true and so touching. So I want to really thank you.
Earlier, I have lived in Bayview in the same house my entire life, but I spent a lot of time in Annisquam. I went to kindergarten here at Mrs. Pappas'. I have two very fond memories of that. Actually, quite a few, but I'm a Pussy Willow girl, and I had bought Pussy Willows when I was there and became a Pussy Willow girl. So my entire life now is Pussy Willows. Every year I have to have my Pussy Willows. I remember going downstairs to get the snack to bring it back upstairs every day. We got to take turns. And Mr. Pappas was the only one I'd ever known to chew on orange rinds. And so I see oranges and I think of Mr. Pappas, because he would cup up all our snacks and we'd come bring them up and he'd be chewing on those rinds. I also remember when my mother would come pick me up from kindergarten, we would quickly clack over the wooden bridge in the big old station wagon. I just can't believe that we actually drove cars over that. And then one more memory of my daughter, when she was about 6 years old, the first time a very large crab decided to latch onto her finger, and everyone hers.
Charles, thank you very much for pulling us all together here. And it makes me think, I've been a resident of Annisquam since I was about 10 years old. And it makes you think about how you could ever write remembrance and have them stick, right? Where anybody that reads whatever you're going to say would give a hoot and put it together. You guys are truly authors, and I think what Lindsay said is really true, that if we've lived here in any one place for a long period of time, we do owe it to ourselves to maybe put those thoughts on paper. But sitting here in the Village Hall, so did I say my name? John. My name's John Burnett. Almost forgot my name. With the wooden bridge right down the hill, maybe just a couple of stories around the venue of the wooden bridge as I was growing up. My parents moved over here when I was 10 years old from Eastern Point, and we rented houses till they died. And so we lived in many houses in Annisquam. But my brother Charlie and I, my dad had a 1960 Camaro, and we probably remember that bridge. Everybody here can remember that bridge. We used to drive on it. And my brother Charlie was a year and a half older than I was, and I would get in that Camaro with him, and it was a convertible. And he would, I don't know who would be talking to. Could have been talking to Paul Lundberg, one of the Lundbergs. And Charlie just kind of wanted to show how cool he was, and he, just hit the throttle, threw it into gear, laid rubber all over the Annisquam, all over the wood bridge, and on we went. Another little vignette was when, maybe there's a few people here who might remember it. There were people who came around that curve by Shays Market at the time and had, no idea of the 90-degree turn that they were about to make, and might have been a little hungover or a little under the weather for whatever reason. And I don't know if anybody here remembers Dana O'Malley, but Dana was driving like an old pickup truck, and he went around that turn, missed the turn, and went straight into the rocks. And because cars were the way they were back then, they were made of real metal, I don't think he was hurt. He didn't have a seatbelt or anything, but I distinctly remember that. I distinctly remember, also associated with that venue of the bridge, Paul, your brother Mark, out there, it had to have been every single day shooting baskets. And probably anybody that's driven around this village remembers that. And the last little story around Annisquam, and there's just so many that would be fun to tell in backyard football, but is, back before there were moorings in the cove, at high tide, a number of us that all grew up together, and it was Elizabeth, and it was Charlie, and it was Jed Smith, living in the Smith house, which is where Reed and David Teal lived. There was a dock back there, and my parents, for my graduation present from St. Peter's, got us a Boston Whaler with a 33 horsepower outboard on it. And we went and did all sorts of really dumb things in that boat. But I won't go into those stories. But I think it was almost like every day in the summer, we were water skiing in that cove. And we went, way down and came back, and we were always going on slalom skiing off of Jed Smith's dock. And we were landing on Jed Smith's dock. We're not landing on Jed Smith's dock. And we had Martha Hudnut with us, and Nancy Gilson, and Tammy Mason for sure. Who else was in that boat? In fact, there was many times when we put at least a dozen people in that boat with no life jackets. But I remember, so the wooden bridge makes me think of those 4 little venues, and there's just so many other stories, but it was a wonderful time in the 60s. Thank you.
Yes. I'd like Susan Aroney to come up and tell us, she's the authority on art in Cape Ann. Tell us a little sketch of artists in Annisquam, if you wouldn't mind.
But what I started with was the art colony in Annisquam. And it was because of 2 factors that the colony kind of grew up here. One was that the Philadelphia Academy of the Fine Arts had some students and faculty members who discovered Annisquam and felt that it reminded them, I believe, of Brittany, where they had been in summer colonies in France. And a relationship developed between the Academy of the Fine Arts and this area. And so this became like a summer school and hangout for artists from Pennsylvania Academy. And that brought some really impressive people up here. Eventually it brought up George Bravely to Lanesville, and several sculptors, including, Anna Huntington was part of the group of sculptors who came here, many of whom came from the Pennsylvania Academy. So there was that factor, and those artists were pretty serious. And there were artists who came from Boston after that. You know, I'm sure this is true of all art colonies on Cape Ann. One artist would lead to another, and especially if the artists were teaching artists. And many of the artists did teach to make a living, but also the faculty members from the Pennsylvania Academy would taught because that's what they did all year. It was natural to them. So there was that, and then there was William Morris Hunt's group of students who came to Annisquam to paint apple blossoms. But that group included Ellen Day Hale and a whole contingent around her. And Ellen Day Hale and the women who came up here to be with her and had come up to study with William Morris Hunt in Magnolia were students at the School of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. A lot of them were studied with the teachers from there and were very influenced from the Boston School, by the Boston School of painters, who painted quintessential 19th century, end of 19th century work of lovely interiors and women who represented civilized life as opposed to the market that their husbands went into. So that whole group of women who were amazing and independent and some of the first women artists to make their mark in American art history came to Annisquam. At one time, actually Cecilia Bone was here for quite a while as well. So it's got a place on the map. And yeah, thank you.
So I'm Jill Babson Carter. And you already know the line. Yes, yeah. Jerry. Can't hear? A little louder? Nicholas?
Close.
Can you hear? Can you hear us now? Yes. Okay. So, our family actually didn't come to Annisquam until my twin brother and I were 10. So, Geraldine is actually the native, and she can talk about that and her times with Mrs. Pappas. But when we came, there were only 3 girls our age: Bootsy Jensen, Jerry Parkhurst, and Jill Babson. Well, Bootsy really never figured in very much because she wasn't a tomboy. So Jerry and I had to stand forth, and there were all these boys: Smith boys, the Hurst boys, the Babson boys, the Ross boys, 2 different Ross families. And they always were playing baseball or skating at the sheep pond behind the Murray House on Denison Street. And of course, Jerry and I had to go along and be goalies, standing there for hours. Or we probably had to go find all the baseballs. But we had to keep our own. And one of the things we loved to do, just loved it, spring would start coming. We sometimes went in on April 1st, swimming. And, but when that, your blood starts to boil when the spring air comes. And we used to go down to the market. Yeah, you tell it. I mean, don't give away too many secrets. Well, we used to borrow rowboats that were tied up. And by then, at that time, didn't matter. I mean, they were little rowboats that we could manage. And we would go out all over the cove and sometimes very bravely out by the yacht club. And we managed always to do it without being found out. We did this year after year. I have a recollection about that, and also about the bridge. And we went to the Leonard School, not Jill, she came after, but when the Leonard School closed, then we were bused to Riggs School, which was on a hill. The hill actually is no longer there. Right across from Richdale's, that was Riggs School. We were picked up at noon. Rusty Smith was in my class. So Ben Smith would come in his old Buick, and in the winter would bomb down that curve and with ice and snow on that bridge, and we were delighted, laughing, and the car was bouncing back and forth on that bridge. And I think, as a couple of people have indicated, and Jill too, life was lived then. Was it more dangerous? Heck, yes. Did we have a lot more fun? Yes. Was there very little parental intervention? Yes. And in the morning, literally, the door was open. We might be there for breakfast or not. Sometimes we'd throw stones out each other's windows, you know, come on out at like 5:30 in the morning. But nobody really worried. And the main rule, I think, Jill, is you had to be back for dinner. That was it. You could do anything you pleased during the day.
And I'll just say one more thing, talking about being dangerous. There was a wonderful woman who lived here, and her name was Gert Griffin. It's her family that had the trolley or the stagecoach that just been renovated. So every morning, Gert, who worked at a bank, Gloucester, and she had her little black sedan with running boards. And she would come chugging up the hill, because she lived down right there next to the, across from the little white house on River Road, I guess next to the Lumbergs. So, yes. So she would come chugging up the hill, and she'd stop, and she'd say, "Okay, kids." And we all would go. We were waiting for the school bus. We would, all of us, mush on to her running boards, and she would drive us around up Rogers Street, down Walnut, and come back to the post office. Those were the days of the post office. Oh my. Our parents wouldn't have liked that, but we
Jill, before you go, could you talk a little bit about racing the fish boats? Because you were...
No, I never won.
You and Jack were part of the gang that raced the fish boats.
Well, actually, we had a turnout, and I never won a race except when we went to Marblehead Race Week, and I was first. I couldn't believe it. And you know what happened? I hit a mark, a buoy. So when I came back, I had to tell them that I had hit the buoy, so I didn't win. But virtue has its own reward. When it became award night at the yacht club, Ben Smith stood up and said, "Well, I have something very unusual to tell you. I have a trophy for a young girl who's never won anything." But, and he told the story, and I have still this pewter's plate from Whitney's pewter shop in Rockport that says Good Sportsman Award. It's the only one I ever won.
Peter Littlefield, known in Annisquam as PD. I was sitting there wondering if I could come up with something coherent to say about growing up in Annisquam. And I guess I will begin by saying that I started my show business career. Annisquam in the 50s had its own show business personality in the form of Russell Crouse. His daughter is right there, Lindsay. And I do have one particular anecdote about Russell Crouse, which is that we were all driving back from Rockport in the Krause's Woody, and Anna Krause was driving, and Russell Krause was in the front seat, he couldn't drive, and Howard Lindsay was sitting next to him, well, the famous playwriting team, Lindsay and Krause, and we all sang, "The hills are alive with the sound of you." I was a kid that was not interested in any of the things that people did in Annisquam. I didn't like sailing, I didn't like tennis. My best friend Daniel Lyman will attest to this. But Annisquam, while intensely conventional in many ways, also made room for oddballs. And I was the chubby little gay kid that you would find walking down Walnut Street at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night singing "The Man I Love." And also, Annisquam was an old New England place. I think a lot of the sort of businessmen and academics that came down here in the summer, from mostly around Boston, they came here to participate in that old New England quality that it had. And also a little bit of wildness that Annisquam had, and always had, from the beginning. And I don't know, there were just a lot of things here that were homemade and old.
Tell us about Foster Damon and the Punch and Judy show.
Well, Foster Damon was really kind of the most important influence in my life. Two old men with mustaches, really, Russell Krause and Foster Damon, had a huge impact on me. Foster lived in a 17th century house on the Cove, which had been a Revolutionary War tavern. And he was a scholar. He was known as the father of Blake studies, and a historian. And he did a lot of research into Punch and Judy, and had written a history about Punch and Judy, and then he started to put it on. Were you in it, Charles?
No, never.
No? I don't know exactly when, in the late 40s, I think, in the Annisquam Seafair. Sorry?
My brother George paid care, and Jack Thornton, who were always acting trouble.
Well, and I think they're listed,
They still remember being in the Punch and Judy show.
and they're listed, I think, in the original script,
I think so.
dedicated to them. I played Punch several years due to nepotism. And the reward for being in Punch and Judy is that he took you up to Walker Hancock's quarry and went swimming, skinny dipping.
Where only boys were allowed.
Well, yes. Listen, it was homoerotic. Not for the boys. But that's, that's a story for another day. But I loved Annisquam. I loved every inch of Annisquam. And even though I had to avoid most of the things that people did in Annisquam. And I absorbed them. And when I went to New York, when I was a kid, I brought Annisquam. I brought a kind of an old-fashioned New England way of making things. Waxworks, kind of old melodramas that we used to put on here, with me to New York. And I kept looking in New York, in the New York theater, for something that was as interesting as that. And I could never find it until I found my way downtown to the East Village, where I put on a lot of shows in clubs, the first of which was called Punch for Boys, that was based on Foster Damon's script. That's a painting by Margaret Fisher Brown over there, Punch and Judy. And in my old age, one of my ambitions was to bring that back to Annisquam. And I've tried to do that a few times in a few shows. Annisquam made room for me. And that's why I love it.
I'm Bob Cunningham, and I'm Ben
Are
Smith.
you Little Ham or Big Ham?
Big Ham. Well, Little Ham was David.
Oh,
anyway, I grew up here in the 50s when the bridge was open for traffic, and Ben Smith's been mentioned, and that reminds me of a story that I was not an eyewitness for, but the report that I got was that he was driving his big Buick or whatever car he had at the time. He used to have these two enormous black Newfoundlands, huge dogs that he would take with him in the car. And so one day he was going across the bridge and he stopped about halfway across and got out of the car to chat with somebody. And one of the dogs climbed into the front seat and the car started to roll. And this woman on the bridge says, "What do you think you're doing?" And he said, "What do you think I'm doing? I'm teaching the dog how to drive."
I'm Paul Lundberg, and I live just down the street. Thank you, Charles. This is fantastic. And like Liz, Warren Huff's bedroom was at the height of Squam Rock. My bedroom was facing the bridge. And so all of these things you heard about the bridge, we heard in stereo every night. You know, we screeching of tires and screaming and yelling and all that kind of stuff. The bridge was always a wonderful challenge. But I just wanted to bring a quick memory of the Seafair, since we're on the eve of the Seafair, and you know, sitting in this room and looking at the legacy of Margaret Fitzhugh Brown. The waxworks were really mysterious and wonderful when you were a small person and you got tapped on the shoulder. But the thing that was my coming of age moment, and I think it happened for a lot of 10-year-old boys, when Seafair morning came around, or Seafair, the night before the Seafair often, and we would come up and we would want to help set up. And Reverend John Elder was heading the church at that time. He was kind of the foreman in charge, and he would give you an assignment, you know, go get some tables and haul them over here and that sort of thing. And so I was just looking for something to do, and I said, and this was back when the Seafair went into the evening. So we had lights strung all over the place so that the festivities could go on after dark. And Jerry Noble, the electrician, was in charge of that, but he needed some help. And so Reverend Elder said to me, "Go help Jerry." I said, "Well, sure." And so I, as a 10-year-old boy, got to help string the lights in the street, in the schoolyard, and that was kind of like my, you know, doing something at the Seafair was like out of the ordinary for all of us, and it was really a very special time. Thank you.
The Seafair is this coming Saturday, and it was always the highlight of the summer. And, you know, particularly the waxworks, which were just unbelievable. I think it was Mr. Brooks. Does anybody remember his first name?
Larry Brooks.
Yeah, he was the MC, and I remember they went around and they would put on the light of that particular display, and he would, you know, grandly introduce. I remember one of them was the assassination of Lincoln. You know, has kind of stuck in my brain. And I love the Seafair, but I was kind of taken aback when I got a call and I was invited to be in the waxworks, and I declined because they wanted me to be Saddam Hussein. Anyway, thank you all. You've been a fabulous audience.
About old Annisquam, and I think it's wonderful to bring them forward, and I just want to thank Pippi and Charles very, very much for encouraging us to